Hey, John. John McWhorter joining Glenn Loury here at the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. Welcome, John. So good to be talking to you.
You too, Glenn. Thanks for having me back.
You're welcome. Oh, come on. You are a mainstay. There would be, let's just put it this way, there would be no Glenn Show of the sort that there exists today, such as it is. Without John McWhorter, surely you are a pillar of this enterprise again,
Well,
such as it is.
Well, thank you. It's been a while. It's one of the most consistent things in my life over the past 20 years. So,
and
definitely.
it's fun. I must say, John, it's fun talking to you. I mean, I really get a charge out of it. I think it's such an interesting relationship. And again, not to get too much into self-reflective, narcissistic, but I'm just saying, I think these conversations, when I look back at some of them and I get transcripts and read over them, are, cumulatively of a certain, edifying and uplifting effect. I think I've learned from talking to you, John. That's really where I'm coming out at the end of this.
Well, I've learned a lot too, and I've actually written a couple of pieces over the past few weeks where I have conceded that I agree with you more than I do about certain things, which I need to send you. And yeah, we've done this over a weird time. There was no Obama when we started, and now here we are, and there's about to be no Obama again.
That's how we got our start, as a matter of fact. Yeah. Doing the Obama, against Hillary and Obama becoming president, and then, oh my God, Obama is president, and then Obama as president,
as a new president. And now he's not even new.
Well, no, he is indeed worth talking about as he is making his exit, because he's laying down markers left, right, and center.
Mm-hmm.
He's getting ready to, if necessary, veto bills out of Congress that reject this Iran deal, so that a major foreign policy move by the United States of America will have been enacted by, in effect, a defiant president who will have imposed his vision, God bless him, over the express will of a majority of the representatives of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And that will resonate with the conservative bloggers and whatnot. They're going to go ballistic, John, I predict.
They certainly will, but history will, I think, be kinder. And it's always good to see Obama having victories on the foreign policy level as well as the domestic. And he seems to be getting better at that. There's been a learning curve, which is good to see. His second term has actually in many ways been more exciting than the first, and there was reason to think that was not going to be the case rather recently. So it's interesting to see. It's big news.
Well, he's definitely performing. I saw this news conference, I don't know if you happened to see it, that he did, the one in which famously Major Garrett of CBS News confronted him about his apparently being content to leave the hostages in Iran, so-called hostages in Iran, out of any bargaining on the nuclear deal, and he reacted very sharply, instructing Major Garrett that what he had said was nonsense and that he should know better.
Mm-hmm.
No, nobody is content. That press conference, that entire press conference, was a tour de force. In my humble opinion, I was stunned. I mean, the president had taken this complicated policy issue about this nuclear agreement, which I'm not obviously going to claim any expertise on, and had broken it down from every possible angle of critique or assessment, and had, and it was extended. It was, after they stopped asking questions, he said, I have a list of points in my hand. Are there any other? I mean, he went fishing for opportunities to get into the detail. And I just can't imagine, I don't know, George W. Bush doing that. I mean, without any disrespect intended to George W. Bush. I mean, there was no net. This guy was performing with no net at that moment. And I was so impressed by the quality of that.
And the nice thing about that also is this gets back to something that we explored about Obama the last time in terms of what is the real him, what was the original him. Let's face it, we have no reason to think that he was particularly interested in Iran or Pakistan or foreign policy 20, 15, or frankly, even 7 or 8 years ago. He's boned up on these things and developed what looks like a real interest. And that's not something all people can do. All people cannot make themselves interested in things. He came in as a domestic president. That's what really set him on fire. That's what he wanted to do. And now here he is leading in some ways more effectively and dramatically on issues which, if you had spoken to, say, the law student Obama of 1990, he would have been surprised that he would ever have been up to his knees in. And yet here he is performing. He's the kind of active mind, which is why I liked the idea of him being president from the beginning, whatever color he was.
Well, he has been president for 7 years, and so you might expect that he would grow in the job, and he certainly has done so.
Hmm.
But he's an extraordinarily talented individual. I don't think there's any getting around that. And he'll be a relatively young ex-president.
Yep.
So I think Obama's an interesting figure to watch here in the 21st century. But be that as it may, we're talking about Obama because we were talking about ourselves, okay?
Mm-hmm.
About the fact that our relationship here at bloggingheads.tv, as, quote, the black guys, that's how we built ourselves initially, the black guys at bloggingheads.tv, that our relationship here was in some ways or another packaged around this Obama era,
Mm-hmm.
which is sadly perhaps coming to a close, although we shall go on, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But that made us, to some degree, have a beat, I think we could say, John. We had a race beat, although, we would be at pains to point out that we're much more than that, and certainly you are, and certainly I am.
But we have a beat, and there's something that we feel in our guts, definitely. Yeah.
We are like public intellectual, social critic guys who write about race, amongst the other things that we are, as I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Not to belabor that. And therefore, just to set the stage for our conversation today, as I know I am aging. I don't know about you, John.
Oh, I'm the same age. I still feel 25. Not at all. But yeah, I know what you mean.
The wheel of time is turning, and it's always interesting to see what the next day and the next year will bring. And in the area of race commentary these days, figures have emerged in prominence who have been outspoken, especially in the aftermath of the Ferguson in Baltimore, the Black Lives Don't Matter, and this moment of reflection about race and all these different things that have happened, about which we have spoken at length here at Blogging Heads. Mm-hmm. That some figures have emerged. Say Michael Eric Dyson has emerged you see him on the Sunday news shows and the op-ed page of New York Times and Washington Post and other places like that. Mm-hmm. And Bill Maher is a kind of cultural icon and so forth like that, competing with Cornel West and whatnot have you. Mm-hmm. And Charles Blow has emerged, a figure who's taken up amongst other things in his column at the New York Times, issues of race and equality, opportunity and justice, movement and so forth, and has written extensively about it. A Ta-Nehisi Coates at the Atlantic mm-hmm. Has now taken on this very large space in American contemporary cultural commentary, writing about race. His long piece on case for reparations at the Atlantic drew notice and became iconic in a certain sense, and his voice in this post-Ferguson moment mm-hmm. has been, amplified and recognized and so on. Now he has a book out that has been highly touted. There was interminable is my word, and I'll stop because I know my introduction here is interminable. There was this interminable piece in the New York Magazine about Ta-Nehisi Coates out at the Aspen Idea Festival mm-hmm. that I read. I must admit I read it. Okay, Ta-Nehisi, if you can hear me, I invested my time in reading that interminable piece that was all about making you into some kind of radical chic new voice of the James Baldwin-esque 21st century character. Mm-hmm. So, of course, John, we have to comment. It falls to us to comment. Forgive me for going on so long, but I just want to get people, focused on what we're trying to talk about here today.
No, it's an important point. If you had asked me in, say, 2008, who I thought would be considered the god of race commentators in 2015, I would have guessed that it would be Dyson, or I thought maybe it would have been Jelani Cobb or somebody like that. I wouldn't have expected it to be Ta-Nehisi Coates, but here we are, and it's interesting. He is his idea in his new book is that racism remains what America's all about, and that America is on the backs of black people, both in past and present, etc. And in a way, I think, as has been remarked on by other people, his fame and the reverence with which he is now treated by the white intelligentsia is evidence against the idea of it being quite as bad as he says. And what's interesting is that it's funny, he's a priest. If you really look at the place that he occupies at this point, there is a religion Not among all white and non-black Americans, but certainly among what you might call the enlightened ones. There is now what a Martian anthropologist would call a religion, which is that one is to understand the role of racism in America's past and present. And Coates has reached a point, and this is not anything I could ever have predicted, where he is the priest of it because, and this is the crucial point. James Baldwin, who Toni Morrison has anointed Coates as being the reincarnation of, his point was often that race is America, that the race problem is the essence of America and where it's been and where it needs to go. And, people read that and they quoted it, but it wasn't something that ordinary white readers really felt at the time. Whereas today, really, that is something that whites feel, such that Coates is revered. He is not considered somebody where you actually assess whether what he's saying is true. You're only supposed to criticize him in the gentlest of terms. He's a priest of a religion. That's not such a bad thing, but I didn't know that we were going to have a priest. Wouldn't you say that at this point there is a religion, which is to be non-racist and to understand that black people have the short end of the stick, and that his reputation at this point is that he is the most articulate, maybe the fiercest, you might put it, articulate person putting forth the scripture of that position. And so we are to read him as Pauline scripture. That's what's going on.
Well, that's a mouthful, John McWhorter. And I'm not sure where to begin in responding. We can play this out over the next 10, 15 minutes. I'll say a couple of things. I think your proposition is interesting, priesthood and religion and the faithful. And I kind of see that about this moment. I think that's right. I mean, I don't have yet my full analysis of this moment because I think this would all have to take into account as again I say, the post-Ferguson moment that we're in here. I mean, I think these stirrings of we have to talk about race. We have to talk about race. I don't
Racism.
Yet know. Yeah. I don't yet know what this all means or what it all comes to. I have remarked here, and I won't go on here now about this, the rise of Al Sharpton, which I think is very interesting. I think a political scientist would probably want to analyze this in terms of Obama's ascendancy and how the shakeout from that has kind of reconfigured the whole public racial, discourse and conversation. I think I've been saying here for a long time that, the new era that we're in, that there's a kind of anachronistic character to the racial claim making based on civil rights and black subordinate and discriminated status, in that the ground has shifted so much, the Latino, the Asian, that the character of discrimination and exclusion is completely different than what it had been 50 years ago. And that a lot of the white response, which is solicitous of these claims, is more patronizing than it is real political compromise. Mm-hmm. That is to say, it's more of exactly what you're putting your finger on here about religion. It's more of signaling a moral position. It's more of, displaying a sentiment than it is of politics and power, of, coalitions that
it has nothing to do with politics, no.
Yeah, so I think there's something right about that. Now on Ta-Nehisi Coates, so the reparations argument, we could play it out. Let's not. I was stunned to see how much mileage he got out of what I regard to be, I'm going to just go ahead and say this, guys, a completely discredited and anachronistic idea. Black
right.
people who do some kind of compensation, surely you mean that symbolically, right?
Right.
Surely, surely you don't actually want to make a claim, any kind of quantitative claim on the basis of history, because the first question that stares you in the face, and again, we're not to talk about reparations here, but I'll just say, why are you framing this in terms of race? Mm-hmm. Why is this black people who are within the context of a civic discourse about American politics? Black people. Let's just get down to basics. So, I just didn't take it seriously, and yet it became this thing. So reading, I decided that what I was dealing with, and I don't think this is unrelated to your religion point, is a kind of cultural expressiveness, okay, because the language is angry, okay? It takes no prisoners, okay? I mean, I actually went back, pardon me, and read James Baldwin's Letter from a Region of My Mind piece in the original New Yorker magazine circa 1961, okay? I just actually went back and read it, okay? I just went back and read it, okay? Baldwin rips the friggin' page apart with these blistering sentences. It is so good, John. It is so on fire, good writing. Man, I mean, you get to the depths of the human soul. There is no thing that he refers to that isn't explored with a kind of resonance and a kind of power. I mean, whether it's preaching or pimping or just being a Joe who can't get anything done in Harlem in 1948, man, you know, so excuse me, and again, with respect to Toni Morrison or whatever, but Ta-Nehisi Coates is no James Baldwin. I know it's very cheap to say that, man. It's very to say, but it happens also to be true. I dare you to go back and read Baldwin 1961. I dare you. Baldwin is describing how the Nation of Islam came to be. Now here, he and Coates perhaps would have a little bit more kinship because Coates has a narrative about the character of racial inequality and oppression, about the long, long shadow of history and property and entitlement that accompanied the subordination of African Americans and that disadvantaged us. And when he plays it out with illustration and example and reference, he does his homework. He will be serviceable, Baldwin, in recounting the character of the discrimination. But as a Baldwin was a great novelist, man. I mean, Baldwin's relationship to the English language in the written word was an order of magnitude of virtuosity above what any one of us scribblers hanging around here today. So, let's be careful with the Baldwin stuff. But anyway, I run on a bit. You say religion. I think that's interesting because it raises the question of heresy. Okay? Because right now, if you criticize this brother, okay, not only is he going to pick up his pen and dismiss you with one of these snarky little quips, in which you become beneath contempt even to be considered as someone worthy of being in the conversation.
And cheered on by millions of people in doing so. Yeah.
But if it's you and me, John McWhorter, our motives are going to come into question because people are going to say, they're jealous of the brother. They wish that they were him, and et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, we are, as critics of this phenomenon, completely disarmed. Or are we?
Well, frankly, I mean, that's certainly what anybody who is a fan of his is going to say if we have anything to say, but hallelujah. But I mean, frankly, if I were only known as a race writer rather than having my language stuff too, and it's at the point where I think, to the extent that I have notoriety, it's about 50-50, I would feel massively unfulfilled. I have never sought to only be a race commentator. If somebody offered me to be Ta-Nehisi Coates, I would refuse it. But I can understand how many people would think that you and I are somehow jealous, but we're not. And what I find more interesting is that it was the reparations article where I realized that the ground had shifted. Because quite simply, I mean, as artfully as he writes, everybody knows that that's never going to happen. And yet, the way that article was praised, it was clear to me that the issue was not whether or not it could happen. As you say, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about the real world. It was, I hate to use this word, but I found myself thinking, it's worship, what people loved. And it wasn't just the artfulness of the prose either. What people loved was that this person had said those things. And I thought, to the extent that it wasn't about anything that could actually happen, it was testament. It was actually that this person was being revered for a kind of a testament. And I thought, it's at the point where what he's saying is thought of as a kind of a liturgy. And Glenn, think of this. Here's something else that doesn't quite make sense unless you understand that there is now a religion, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Good, because it means that a lot of white people really have seen the light in a way. Bad, because religion is not politics. But think of this new idea that the good white person is supposed to acknowledge their privilege. I acknowledge that I'm privileged, the person is supposed to say. And notice that that doesn't do anything. And yet that is considered the most important thing. And I wrote a piece questioning all this in the Daily Beast. And the response was very interesting. Many white people were clearly, truly offended that I would say, well, when you acknowledge your white privilege, it doesn't really do anything for us. I had clearly tripped them up in a certain way. And even there, this was a few months ago, I thought to myself, okay, what this is it's religion again. The idea is that you have original sin, that you have this guilt. And what you do by participating in the religion, acknowledging your guilt, doing penance, eating the wafer, what you're doing is you are being religious. And so I acknowledge my guilt, and then life goes on as it is. And yet somehow you see yourself as having done something by saying that you acknowledge this privilege. Once again, we're dealing with a creed. People really are feeling it to that extent. Try getting a white person circa 1965, some housewife with a bouffant hairdo living in Larchmont, New York, to say, I acknowledge my privilege as a white person. Even if she was reading the New Yorker, she wouldn't have understood that at all. Betty Draper on Mad Men. And now here we are. That very person considers it a valuable statement to make that religious kind of testament. It's beautiful in its way. And of course a religion has a priest, and, why not Ta-Nehisi Coates? But it does worry me that this religion has nothing to do with actually creating change.
Okay, so we have the McWhorter analysis of the situation. To wit, Ta-Nehisi Coates is high priest of a certain religion or cult or, kind of community of faith around matters racial, in which the acknowledgement of the unearned privileged position of whiteness, and oh, by the way, his attack is on whiteness, I did, John, I won't go on about it, glance at the pages of Between the World and Me, which
Glenn, I should interject
memoir.
and say that I have not read that book. Anyway.
Yeah, and I'm not asking us to talk about the book. I said I glanced at a page, and all I'm saying is I'm trying to take the measure of what's the argument here. Mm-hmm. And what's the sermon? Okay, we're going to talk religious metaphor. I'm with that. I think that's helpful, John. What really is the message in the sermon here? And I think part of it is an indictment of whiteness as such, the foundation of the country, the meaning of democracy, the credibility of our, civic creed and faith, the comfortable image with which we regard ourselves. I use the word we here now, not in the Ta-Nehisi Coates exclusive sense of speaking of Black people vis-a-vis this phenomenon, but I use the term we, and I wonder what Coates would say critically of this in terms of my location within the national dynamic. I am American. This is me. Mm-hmm. I don't know that he would necessarily disagree with this, but I thought your point about Baldwin was profound. Exactly. The race question was at the heart of America. It wasn't a scalpel used to separate off. Okay. It was a window onto the soul of the country. It was our. So this is where I will go critical here just for a moment, because the shallowness of the response to this catastrophe of behavioral dysfunction within the African-American community, okay? I am talking about families, all right? Charles Blow writes on the New York Times op-ed page, sillily, that
Did you say sillily?
Sillily. I said sillily. I made the word up. that Black fathers are the best. Come on, that's ridiculous. Okay, with 2/3 of Black children living in households without fathers, don't try to remake all of human culture in the interest of some cheap political argument. Be a little bit in respect of the weight of history. So violence, okay? The New York Magazine piece, the interminable piece about Coates, dwells on an encounter at Aspen in which the mayor of New Orleans, Landrieu, shows up to try to make the case that Black Lives Matter, and in particular the ones that are being extirpated on a daily basis by other Black people matter, and that's a first order, not a second order, not a we'll entertain it later. It's a major frontline issue with respect to governing a city like Baltimore or New Orleans today, or Chicago today. A major frontline first order existential crisis is unfolding. Okay, so now, if you're going to contemplate the soul of America and you have nothing to say about the soul of that, other than I used to be a little gangbanger myself, and I used to think I could go get my piece and shoot somebody. This is Coates in this memoir, talking to his son, bragging, in effect, about he kept a tool and he knew how to go get in and confront a motherfucker. You see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? Okay, that posture is adopted. Okay. Now, I don't know if anyone has read Jill Lavoie's book, Ghetto Side. It is a report from the front lines by a Los Angeles Times reporter about homicide in Watts, Los Angeles. Okay, it goes on for 250 pages, and it'll break your heart. Okay? Now, the glib retort, we have structural racism. Of course, structural racism will manifest itself in terms of the self-destructive behavior, people trapped in a box and influenced by all of these historical forces of white supremacy and dominance. Of course, they hate themselves. What else would they think, given that white people hate them? No wonder they admit to the violence, given that the blah, 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 blah. A glib, little, cute, tricky political retort like that, in the face of the existential crisis in the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, infuriates me and disqualifies somebody from being high priest of anything.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, part of what people cherish about Coates is that the authenticity. I mean, that the street part. I haven't read the book, but in many of his pieces he mentions that there was that aspect of his background. He did one piece in the Times, I think, that was about why a certain demographic of black man might be quick to anger and quick to be violent because of the nature of the streets. And of course, that means that he is speaking from a kind of experience. There are many people who feel that if you're going to be a valid black commentator, you are supposed to have suffered racism in a certain direct way, or you're supposed to have spent time with or identified with what many people quietly think of as real black people, although if you try to analyze the issue, they say, well, what do you mean by that? And so you and I are people who are, smoking our pipes and drinking our sherry and sitting in our studies and, making theories, whereas he is a journalist who's coming from sort of the streets himself. But, Glenn, all of this still, and I'm not trying to be cute here, it makes sense as religion, once again, in that, for example, how did you fit all the animals into the ark? Or why does God let bad things happen? Well, why is it that the Gospels are not consistent? Why does Genesis have two different versions of the creation myth practically on the first page? There are all of these questions that, you're not supposed to ask, or the answers that you get aren't quite coherent, but you're supposed to, keep your hands on your lap and let it go by. This is religion. And so, of course, Charles Blow will say that boys this summer are shooting each other in the street over sneakers or what have you because, well, racism. Society doesn't like them. And you're not supposed to ask too many questions. Of course, Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives do matter. But if you say, well, why is it that we're saying that Black Lives Matter more when white people take them than when black people take them? Well, you're not supposed to ask the question, or if somebody gives an answer to it. Jamel Bowie in Slate has written that there's a difference between keepers of order killing and ordinary citizens killing. Well, if that doesn't satisfy you, still, you're supposed to just be quiet, especially if you're white. You're supposed to acknowledge your privilege, and you're supposed to leave it there. This is religion. In other words, it's not supposed to completely make sense. It's really gotten to the point that we are dealing with a liturgy that is more about feelings than reason. And that, okay, I think, very quickly, that's the problem. That we're no longer thinking about pragmatics, we're thinking about feelings.
I think you and I are in agreement about that. I want to explore the implications of it. I think one area of implication has to do with the effectiveness of political activity and policy and so on, if this is not a politics and it's somewhat orthogonal to the work and the coalitions and the conceptions that you need to actually change things on the ground. That's one angle of implication. But another would have to do with the character of the discourse itself. As I say, within a religious community, heresy becomes a crime, and the capacity to engage in critical assessment of what's going on. For example, I think this elevation of Michael Brown to some kind of iconic status
Jesus. Yeah.
Frankly, I mean, come on, man, come
He's
on.
Jesus.
Come on. The best we can tell about what happened out there on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, is that Michael Brown was in the wrong. I mean, he confronted and provoked and generated a conflict with an armed police officer that ended in his death on circumstances that 2 independent investigations have concluded did not warrant any kind of further reaction or reprimand. So Michael Brown is not an embodiment or a reflection or an illustration or an example of anything with respect to the impairment of the rights of African Americans, with respect to the illustration of the dominance of the contempt for our bodies, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, I know his body lay on the streets of Ferguson for an inordinately long period of time and perhaps was not as well tended to by those authorities as it ought to have been. But I'm still just saying, okay? So I'm now just trying to provide fodder and evidence of the religious character of this, because
He's
if
an
you
icon,
say to somebody, because if you say to somebody, Michael Brown is no Rosa Parks, Michael Brown is no Emmett Till either, please. The response from these people on these college campuses and in these liberal magazines and comic sections and so forth and so on will be a ton of bricks will fall on you. So heresy. So how do you criticize? I mean, and also, by the way, vastly inflated reputation and vastly understated critical assessment. Charles Blow is embarrassing himself at the op-ed page in the New York Times. I'm just going to say that. Okay, that column about the Book of the Dead, okay, which was about confronting the Jill Lavoie-like ghetto side evidence. This now with respect to the city of New Orleans. After all, he is from Louisiana. The mayor invited him there to see the books, which were the unresolved and open homicide cases of people of color, almost exclusively killed by other people of color in that city. And he writes, oh, there's structural racism. And unless you understand that this black on black termination of life is embedded within a structure which is dominated by whites, you might have the mistaken conclusion that black people have some responsibility here. And I just put my newspaper down when I read that, and I scratched my head and I said, what is this man doing writing on the op-ed page of the New York Times?
Well,
this is a disgrace, okay? So y'all go ahead and crucify me, okay? Because I am out. I've had it up to here with the major cultural organ left of center in this country not taking black people seriously. Let me say it once more time, David Brooks, who opens his column, Dear Ta-Nehisi Coates, and ponders and wonders whether or not, as a white person, he deserves to have an opinion about this. Will you please treat black people like you would treat any other component of political culture at this moment in this country at this time? Will you please take us seriously? Okay? Because, by the way, Mr. Coates, you have presumed that you have a right to comment about everything else. Why would you defer to Ta-Nehisi Coates with respect to commenting about this aspect of your country? How does that even get to be a question? Okay, so let me just sum up. I pick up the newspaper, I read it, I mean to be led into a reflective encounter with the fundamental questions of my time, and instead, what I find on race issues is pablum, sophomoric. It's a disgrace. Okay, I've said it. Y'all do what you want about that, but that's how I feel.
I am not going to go as far as saying that Charles Blow doesn't deserve to be on the page, partly because I don't like saying things like that about people, and partly because, frankly, in terms of what the page is these days, he's fitting right into it, and that page is one that subscribes to this religion. And I really mean literally this religion. And he's a good proponent of it too. I mean, with Charles Blow, I have to speak carefully because I bear no animus against the man. What you're supposed to be reading with Blow, and this is what I mean by it's a religion, is that he writes artfully. When you read his 600 words, you can tell that every one of those sentences has been very carefully crafted. I mean, they only have so much space. He uses the buzzwords in a beautiful way. There's a warm heart that pulsates from it, and if people want to say that I'm being condescending, no, I'm not saying that at all. I actually would be incapable of writing as warmly as he does, even if I wanted to. If I wanted to grab people by the collar and do it, I envy him sometimes. But we're supposed to be reading what he's writing as almost a kind of poetry. He's writing scripture. He is writing biblical prose. Now, what I've learned to do, I'm not as angry as you, Glenn, and it's because I have mastered a certain mental equipoise, and I slip, especially if I haven't had enough sleep. That rhetoric, what we're talking about as not worthy, this what you see as so condescending, David Brooks, pretending to think that he has no right to question something that somebody wrote just because they're black and they have a way with a pen. None of that has anything to do with being concerned with black uplift. And black uplift has to take place separately from that. It has nothing to do with Charles Blow and his artful prose. So all those people are going to be doing the Bible. That's what they're doing, I think of it these days. It's religion, and I can't say it's a terrible thing, but it will have nothing to do with changing poor black people's lives. And there are things going on that front. But they're not doing what James Baldwin was doing. The times have changed. They're doing something else. And therefore, I'm not mad. I'm not mad at them. I think they think they're doing something. But I'm not as mad at them as you are, because I just figure that there are things going on that have become disconnected from what a certain segment of the punditocracy is interested in. So I just figure, let them do it.
But what I'm saying is that meanwhile, the actual lived experience of people at the bottom, black people at the bottom in the country unfolds. And I'm saying, like I say, existential questions. I just think they're profound challenges that are not, being faced. And so that's the source of my,
it's hard,
of my fury.
Yeah. I wrote a piece in the Daily Beast that I'm going to plug here because I really meant it.
My mild fury, if I may say, mild fury. Not,
I was saying that...
Okay, you're plugging the Daily Beast piece of your recent piece in the Daily Beast.
Quick 4 things I said. I said there needs to be, big surprise, end to the war on drugs. I said that we need to have effective teaching of reading to poor black students, and I explained which ones. I said that we need to give poor women in general, but poor black women is my beat, we need to have long-acting, reversible contraceptives because studies have shown that they help people not to have kids until they're ready, and people who've been given them like them. So I said we need that. And then my 4th thing was that I said that we need to get rid of this idea that a poor black person needs to go to 4 years of college, that we need to start celebrating vocational schools and what they can do because you...
Okay, Jeff.
And so I said those things. And Glenn, what I mean is those things can happen and be pursued completely separately from anything artful that somebody like Charles Blow writes in the New York Times or doesn't write. Right?
There are marginal policy changes, and I don't mean them by marginal to belittle them, but they turn out not to be big ideological statements that could have ending the war on drugs is in itself an ideological battle of a certain sort, but certainly more effective contraception and a vocationally focused educational track that looks to young adult employment prospects as the gold standard. Those things are feasible, they're doable, and no, they don't depend on the bluster that Michael Eric Dyson might offer on a Bill Maher or whatever. They don't depend on that. I agree. I would like to say something else, if I may, and it has to do with what I think the source of the religion is. I said I wanted to analyze. I liked your metaphor, but I wanted to use it to analyze. And one of the things I wanted to do was to explore the implications of religion, implication of its being a religion, implication for the effectiveness of people's politics, and implications for the capacity to have a reasoned internal dialogue amongst African Americans about what we should be doing. But also the sources of it. Why a religion, and why a religion now?
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Why now and not 20 years ago, and so forth and so on? And I think where it comes from is the failure of racial liberalism. Okay, again, Glenn Loury's going to get into trouble. I don't like what Charles Blow's been writing in the New York Times op-ed page, and I don't think very much about what stands for racial liberalism these days. I'm talking about the civil rights community. I'm talking about the advocacy of black people's interests and rights. I think they're failing. They're failing miserably in the face of a profound historical challenge, which is, as I've said, the transformation of the racial landscape and of the structural issues affecting the relative position of blacks in this society from what it had been in a period of white exclusive domination to what it is now. We're a global community, man. Oh, let me just give you one example. I'm going to give you one example, okay? Yesterday, a graduate student of mine asked me to evaluate her teaching. She's teaching in a summer program at Brown. The course is game theory for high school students. So this is economic theory with a little bit of algebra, made simple and accessible to high school students. The class was full of fresh-faced adolescents, all of whom were white and Asian, roughly a third of Asian ancestry. They got a beautiful lecture from my graduate student, of whom I'm proud. And I looked around this room, and it was packed, okay? There were like 40 people in there. And they're getting this course, which is this cram. It's like 2 weeks, 4 hours a day or something like that.
One of these summer things, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of these summer enrichment things. It's a summer enrichment thing, okay? I looked around that room, and there weren't any black people in there. Now, here's my question. Okay, the fuck has structural racism got to do with that? Okay, will you please give me a break? Okay, our kids not being in that room is our failure. Let me just say it once more. After so many generations in America, and after such a large African-American middle class has come into existence and occupies enclaves of upper middle class status all over this country, the failure to get our kids into that room is our burden here in the 21st century, okay? Now, this failure that I'm talking about of racial liberalism, which can't recognize that, okay, which uses, I've said it before, forgive me, the Bill Cosby disgrace to discredit the argument that there are cultural failures in the lower classes of African-American society that are condemning people there to continued poverty, and that attention to some of those behavioral aspects, which are within our capacity to control, would not only produce better outcomes, but would elevate our humanity. Okay? That argument is completely driven from the page in our time. So here's what. The failure of racialism results in religion as the only way to avoid the implications of that failure, and as an easy answer to the challenge of having to overcome that failure, which I think is the fundamental philosophical and intellectual challenge confronting black people now.
Glenn, you are correct. And I would add that, yeah, that's why there's the religion. It's a replacement. And if you want to ask why it happened, I think it's because, and I have written about this in Losing the Race and mostly in Winning the Race, it's that the Civil Rights Revolution, in a way, it happened too fast. Not that I am unhappy that it happened, especially since I'm a direct beneficiary of exactly what happened and how quickly, but it happened too fast, I think, for Black America to fully feel that we had climbed out of our own hole. And so this is the magnificent Shelby Steele point. I think it left a hole in Black America's soul. There's a certain basic insecurity. It would be surprising if we're not there. And as a result, the idea that we must do it isn't there. There's a disconnect because we made the country bow down, and it all happened so quickly that I think we were kind of blinking in the light by about 1970. Thus, once again, the religion. And so why in the world does everybody think black people are dumb? But then on the other hand, you talk about these schools and these programs, and we're constantly having NAACP branches arguing that it's not fair to expect our kids to take serious standardized tests, that the tests are racist if black kids don't do well on them. And then, why does everybody think black kids are dumb? You're not supposed to be asked. It just becomes the religion. The reason that we don't spontaneously think, as many West Indian and African parents do, well, we have to just make sure our kids do well on the test, is because of that habit of mind from the 60s. That's why we have this religion. That's what I would imagine that this sort of thing might be happening in South Africa as well. I get the feeling this isn't particularly local. This is ordinary sociology. And so here we are.
Yeah, I think we want to be careful with the comparisons, but I see the comparison. Could go into it. I think the test thing is a very important example, John, because those arguments are still being made. The test is effectively discriminatory because the pass rate for blacks is different. And in effect, that's an acknowledgement that blacks are unable to perform on the thing. It's an implicit critique of the standard. The test is not supposed to be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get into all this mushy kind of thing where, you know, some of the issues with respect to cognitive development,
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about cognitive development, the capacity to read a text and absorb ideas, the ability to analytically frame a problem and to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
This is human development. This is human. It has no frigging color.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? When such instruments as are available systematically report to you that a half century after the height of the civil rights movement, the African American population on the average is still significantly, I'm talking about a standard deviation difference.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? 15 full percentile points in a normal scale distribution from the median.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It's consistently underperforming whites with respect to our capacity to measure cognitive functioning. And your response is to attack the test and not to address the processes by which cognitive functioning is acquired with urgency and alarm. You are intellectually bankrupt.
Mm-hmm. And you know,
I'm sorry. No priest can hide that reality from the probing eye. You know what? Most white people know it already.
yeah, they don't say it out loud. You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to ask too many questions. But they don't say it. And yeah, it's interesting. I honestly believe that there are some people who think, and it's hard to get somebody to actually attest to it, but I've seen it a few times, that if black kids did perform at that level on geeky tests, there would be something unblack about it, that somehow that wouldn't be an authentic thing to do. And what's interesting is, it's funny, you mentioned the summer programs. I happened to do a guest lecture the other day on, I got so little sleep last night, I can't think of Rousseau. I was doing Rousseau because somebody was out. And our summer program happens to be pretty much all brown. They're all black and Latino and other brown kids from around the New York area. And boy, were they on top of it. They were smart.
Wow.
They asked questions almost as good as the undergrads here. And I was thinking, these kids are great. I don't see anything unauthentic about them. They're not growing up thinking they're white, and yet they are doing their jobs. You can be of color and yet have things to say about a tough passage of Rousseau that you were asked to read. I just wish that we saw that more in this country, and it can't happen if we say that our kids can't take tests.
Oh, yes, indeed. What you say is so true. I just love it, John. You were pinch hitting to discuss Rousseau with some kids, and the kids are black and brown at Columbia Summer School, and they just are all over
They were great.
My man Rousseau, which is some interesting philosophical discussion. I'm sure it was just grand. And I want to talk about stereotypes for a minute, because there's the idea that these kids are not authentically black if they are interested in this, which involves a certain kind of stereotype about what you think blackness is. There's also the presumption, I don't attribute it to you, that some would be surprised that they were all over Rousseau and had interesting things to say about it, that
Dead
these
white
kids
man,
are not,
right.
Not somehow on top, or that they're just not good enough to read the text and have anything to
Can't
say
get
about
through
it.
it,
Because they're inner city kids that need a graphic novel version of Rousseau in order to be able to engage with it. So there's that kind of stereotype. But there's also, man, I hear you about this authenticity. I don't know how many times Ta-Nehisi Coates has been robbed at gunpoint. But I'll bet you I've been robbed at gunpoint more time than he does. Here, that's something we could do. We both got high incomes. Okay, no, it's not verifiable because you can always say you were robbed 18 times. I'm just saying, just because I happen to have a PhD from MIT don't mean I don't know nothing about the ghetto.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And what is this anyway? Stereotyping blackness as being authentically represented when the dialect and the hip hop lilt and the gangsterisms are most vivid.
Mm-hmm.
What's that? What's this about toughness? What's this basically about? Manliness and about the embodiment of the suffering of the black body. I love this focus on the body, man, because it is so Freudian. Wait a minute, we're gonna do Rousseau. Can we do some Freud here?
Mm-hmm.
It's so subterranean, suggestive about what the deep tectonic plates of social power are. And I tell you, they have something to do with human reproduction. I'm sorry, I have to point that out.
It does. It does.
So anyway, uh,
I can tell
I don't
where
know.
you're about to go. I don't know if you should.
No, I ain't going there, man. I'm just
But
messing.
that
I'm
is
just
in it.
messing around.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's what James Baldwin would not. That's a stone that Brother Jimmy Baldwin would not leave unturned. You know what I'm
I
saying?
do know what you're saying.
You know, he would not go there. He would definitely go there.
There is one I might slip in here that there are some people who might suppose, I don't know whether it's overtly or not overtly, that geekiness is feminine, that there's a necessity for a certain kind of masculinity among black men to protect themselves from what the world is going to give them. And that could pollute our discourse in certain ways, I think. Although, again, I don't know how many people are going to openly attest to it. But the idea might be that sex roles are different in black culture by necessity because of the exigencies of the street and of history. But the whole notion of black body does have all sorts of coded resonances, and even sometimes just outright statements. But yeah, that's very much there. And I've noticed undergraduates very much respond to that phrase too, the black body phrase. Again, biblical buzzwords, but it's very much there.
I'm just going to go this far with the Freud thing. Okay, I'm going to go this far and no further. I dare anybody to type interracial dominance into a search engine. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a minute. We've been talking about the domination of the black body.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the rhetoric of the Black Lives Movement feeds on.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the Charles Blow and Ta-Nehisi Coates frequently refer to. So I dare you, I want to talk about the reality of American culture and power, to type interracial dominance into a search engine.
Mm-hmm.
I am almost certain that what you're going to get is porn.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the search engine is an objective measure of the surfing habits of the aggregate of people who are online.
Mm-hmm.
What comes to the top of that is calculated by an algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
So this is data. Okay, this is data about. I'm sorry. Let me just be a little bit more explicit. It's going to be black men sexually dominating white women.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I'm saying that is just beneath the surface of the consciousness of some non-trivial component of American society in terms of sexuality, power, bodies, and so on.
So you mean when somebody talks about black bodies, what they're really talking about is white men's discomfort with the possibility that a black man might dominate a white female body?
I'm saying that's a part of it, and it might not be discomfort. It might be delight.
And of course, this was openly true not so long ago. But we're saying that that's now true of some cop in Oakland, some cop in Baltimore. That
I'm saying this deserves to be explored. I don't mean to make light of something that's a very serious and profound issue.
Yeah.
I'm saying though that in this religious metaphor that you have created about how to understand this critical moment in terms of race commentary.
Mm-hmm.
The emergence and ascendancy of Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, but also what I've declared to be pablum that passes for social commentary at organs like the New York Times and many other places besides, and the easy pass that the post-Ferguson crowd have gotten with respect to all their remonstrations about white privilege and so forth and so on, which adds up to not very much at the end of the day. And we're trying to understand this moment, and you've offered a religious metaphor, and so I'm saying within that,
mm-hmm.
within that experience of religion, are all of these different tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of human consciousness.
Good metaphor.
That control our will and that govern in some level. This is my crude reference to Freud. And I'm just, and I don't want to go on too long about this, just trying to say that black sexuality, black male sexuality
mm-hmm.
is a huge part of that. Now we can parse, and as I say, it deserves a serious treatment, exactly for whom and in what ways and because of what relations and what complexities and what are the strengths and weaknesses thereof and what does that mean about objectification and blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I just think that's a part of the piece. And as I say, James Baldwin would be all over it.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay. And also, if I may, I'm on a roll here, John, just very briefly. This black men killing other black men stuff is a profoundly interesting phenomenon in our time. Do you know there's a guy called Papa Christos? He's a sociologist at Yale, studying violence networks in American cities like Baltimore and Chicago, tracing the relationships amongst the people who are the perpetrators and the victims of the violent acts, mostly homicide, and learning that almost all of the homicide activity in these big cities is going on within very well-defined structures of 2, at most 3 degrees of separation networks in which people are related to each other in one way or another. And the beefs, which are being resolved by deadly gunfire and such, have to do with the kind of disputes. Some of them are about drugs and stuff like that, but it's mostly about personal affronts and about vendetta and payback and honor and dignity and, you mess with my woman and stuff like that. But it's a very focused phenomenon. And I was just trying to say it is one of the most interesting, tragic aspects of social organization in contemporary America. And it's very black. It's a racial phenomenon as these networks play out within largely race-exclusive sets of individuals who are associated with one another. And I was saying this phenomenon of which people are making light, and they're laying it off because they don't want to lose a political argument about Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, the black lives that are taken by other black people matter. It's not just the police. They want to keep the focus on the police, and so they don't want to lose that argument. They're laying off this phenomenon, too many of these commentators, in terms of some reference to the larger structure of racial domination in which blacks are subordinate. But I'm saying that fails to take black people seriously. I'm sorry if I repeat myself. Only to the extent that it fails to impute the agency for people about governance at the level of their actual lived experience. I mean, it is, a profound challenge to us about this behavior. So, and what it means, okay, yes, in some historical sense, you can attribute as the endpoint of a progression of events that are largely a dominance and a white supremacist thing, if you want to make that historical
but it's
frame.
It's too fragile to resonate here in the present is the problem.
Exactly. And it doesn't touch the humanity of this. This is why Baldwin keeps coming back, because I just feel, not that he would necessarily agree with me about anything, that and Baldwin at the end of his life didn't write like Baldwin at the beginning of his career, in my humble opinion, was much too pedantic, didactic, preachily, and rigidly ideological and bitter, and closed off to anyway. So this is Baldwin, but I mean, I'm just saying, if we were going to have great writing about this phenomenon, we would have to go there and dwell there and stay there for a while.
Just to play devil's advocate, the problem is we have to ask, okay, so what would you do? It's not as if there haven't been a lot of people of all colors and persuasions who want to stop these boys from shooting each other in America's cities. And obviously, it's a tough nut to crack. And in a way, I look at these people who are making the excuses and the circular arguments and pretending that the reason is racism and coming up with ever more flexible definitions of racism to cover it. These people are on their knees in a way. You look at something that is so tough. And what you're seeing a lot of people doing, the white New Yorker readers, the star black columnists, they're praying. They're getting down on their knees and they're praying. They're going to church. And it's because just a second, Glenn.
Can I say?
And it's because
yes, sir.
They don't know what to do. And the thing is, I'm not sure you or I do either. So Glenn,
I'm not buying it. I do know what to do. You make league with the police. You don't make them your enemy. Okay? Let me just say that again, okay, because this is no holds barred, the Glenn Show this time around. The police are your friends. They're not your enemies. The police are your main response to disorder and violence in your midst. They are not the problem. If there's going to be any solution, it's going to involve them in a central way. So this book that I have mentioned several times now, Ghetto Side, about homicide in Los Angeles, is framed around the activities of homicide detectives, some of whom their whole reason for being is let me just finish this, is proving to black people who are weeping over the dead bodies that somebody gives a damn about them. Because do you know what if those homicide detectives who are valorized and perhaps romanticized, and Jill Lavoie's telling, were not there, there would be nobody to affirm that the state cared anything about its absolutely essential obligation to maintain a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, which is to say, to ensure that people can be secure in their persons. Okay, now these are mostly white cops.
So they're not Wendell Pierce on The Wire.
Okay.
We're talking about white versions.
Not every cop is perfect, obviously. I have to say that, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, there are egregious acts that need to be responded to. And of course, people should be held accountable when they do these things. But the posture of advocacy for the interest of African Americans now, vis-a-vis the actual forces that delimit our freedom of person and security, should be collaborative with the forces of authority. You say people don't know what to do? I know what to do. You make the police your partner, not your enemy. All the work that's going to have any impact on this is going to come via that kind of a mechanism.
In those circles, there's the stop snitching ethos, where exactly what you're saying is what is so difficult to effect, because the people in the community on all levels are often loath to collaborate with the police because of what they've seen the occasional bad ones doing, and I suspect also because of the ideology that we talk about and have problems with that's in the air. And so the question, yes, it would be nice if these communities would work with the police more. Certainly, the police are always complaining that it's so hard to get any information out of so many of the community's residents. But the question is, how do you change it? What, are we going to knock on doors?
No. And it's not going to happen overnight. And I want to affirm right off that the primary party responsible for affecting this change are the police and the civil authorities themselves. Okay, so the failure here is not only, or perhaps even mainly, a failure of an Al Sharpton or somebody who wants to make the police into the enemy, and I believe has framed the issue of the security of Black people in the country wrongly, because I don't think the police are the primary threat to the security of Black people in this country. And I think that the issue of the security of Black people in their lives and in their person in this country is a first order sort of world historical significance. I mean, the magnitude of the thing is just off the chart. Anyway, all of the backtracking aside, it's not going to happen overnight, and the police would have to be instrumental and would have to be involved in it. But what I want to mention is the work of the esteemed economist Roland Fryer, my colleague and former student who's at Harvard. MacArthur Prize winner and winner of the John Bates Clark Award in Economics, which is a very prestigious honor annually given to an economist under the age of 40 who's done outstanding work.
He's under 40?
And Roland won that. Yeah, Roland is like 37.
Anyway, go ahead.
I just want to tell you this, because he just presented a paper at the summer meetings of the National Bureau for Economic Research, which is all the hotshot empirical economists are presenting their trial run stuff to get their colleagues unvarnished criticism. And Roland just presented a paper in Cambridge here on his study of the sources of racial disparity and the incidence of police violence. So he's got a data set. I could go into it. I won't. There's no time. The data set has been very carefully manicured and massaged in order for several hundred cases of police violence to measure the circumstances surrounding those cases. So there will be measurements pertaining to the nature of the individual, the character of the encounter, the setting in which it took place, and so on. And then what he does is a multivariate regression analysis to try to account for the differences in the incidence of police violence against Black versus white citizens. And what he finds is that with respect to the use of deadly force, he can account in his data for the evident surface racial disparity by reference to the circumstances. In other words, yes, cops shoot Blacks more frequently, other things equal, than they shoot whites. But if among those other things you're holding equal are, what time of day was it? What part of the city was it in? What was the lighting? What was the setting? Was the person fleeing from the this and that, blah, 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 blah. Then you can account for the racial difference pretty much. In homicide, shootings, But with respect to the police use of force, what he calls putting hands on people. Police grabs you by the collar and forces you to the ground. The policeman puts his knee in your back. The policeman smacks you upside your head. The racial disproportion in the incidence of that happening to blacks versus whites cannot be accounted for by any of the objective circumstantial measures. And the disparity is huge, so huge that Rowland is prepared to conclude, reaching somewhat beyond his data, that this could account for the attitude of non-cooperation in black communities with respect to the police, because while the police are not, as someone would say, killing them once you control for circumstances at anything that's inordinate, they put their hands on them frequently. Much more frequently and without account. And you can only speculate about why that might be. But of course, the subordinate status of African Americans and the devalued status of blackness in the society would be prominent.
You know what's annoying, Glenn? This is the last thing I'm going to say. That is a very interesting study. And that's going to get around because Rowland is good. And I love the way his studies address something that you could talk to somebody about at a party. You have an elevator pitch with almost everything he writes. But what's going to get around, talk about the religion, is the hands-on part. And then the fact that he also says that the other kind of disparity, cannot be attributed to racism is going to be something treated as a little head scratcher at the end of the articles where somebody else says something else kind of resonant that makes you not think about it. That's the way that's going to be covered. Whereas the truth, if this is how the article goes, is really something actually more interesting. It's not a right-wing conclusion. It's somewhere in the middle. And I don't think that our race debate can handle that. Not that it ever has been able to, but certainly what's going on right now won't handle that. What we're going to learn is that cops probably in general, are more likely to physically grab a black person. That's what's going to come out of it, not the other part. Wouldn't you say?
Yes, I agree with you about that. That's kind of parallel with the Ferguson thing where the exoneration, or if you will, non-guilty finding with respect to Darren Wilson's behavior has been buried in the commentary in the Ferguson report, the larger assessment of police community relations undertaken by the Justice Department with respect to Ferguson, Missouri, has gotten a lot of play. I just want to say you're about to go one more thing for the record in the context of this conversation, and this is again about Ghetto Side, this magnificent reportage concerning homicide in Los Angeles by Jill Lavoie, and that's this. And this lines up with what Papa Christos is finding in his surveys of these violent networks. Those killings in Watts, in South Central Los Angeles, of largely, almost exclusively black men by other black men, are happening in neighborhoods that are often majority Hispanic. Now, well, she's right about now. Those neighborhoods are many of them are majority Hispanic, and the relationship between the Hispanic and the black in terms of the violence, very nasty, because the Hispanics are disproportionate victims of the inner black Hispanic violence relative to being perpetrators of it. I'm not saying that they are free of anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the micro-social landscape, the kind of anthropology of the violence and race, is richer and more interesting than any 800-word column that you're ever likely to read at one of these websites or on one of these editorial pages. And it deserves our attention. So again, that's just my
get it.
Thanks. Yeah, John, you went out on a limb and expressed your views about Ta-Nehisi Coates. I expect that your career is over.
Well, luckily I've always got another one, but yours might be as well. So we'll see if they cancel the Glenn show because of it. But
no, I like that what you say about you don't just write about race and therefore your whole being isn't turning on whether or not people can recognize the value of what you do there. And likewise, neither do I. And I know the security of having a real day job in the racial commentary business. Okay, enough said.
Glenn, it's more fun to be us. Talk to you real soon.
Bye-bye.